Welcome, everyone, and I would like to thank everyone for putting up with extra chairs at their tables and for queuing at the front to try to get a ticket today, and to the staff at Northwood Hall for being so accommodating. But we got about 25 more people in than we thought we were going to have, so thank you all. Before we begin today's program, I'd like to just tell you very briefly about the next program, which is our annual meeting on May 27th. We have a program on the Affordable Care Act. Is it working? I think it'll be a very, very interesting program because, as you know, some of the issues are before the Supreme Court now. And we have Insurance Commissioner Mike Kreidler, who will look at things from the state point of view. He has been here before and has been very well received. Then University of Washington health policy expert Aaron Katz, who's going to look at the overall national picture. And then we have Sue Sharp, who's the executive director of the Chuckanut Health Foundation, who's going to be looking at what's happened in Whatcom County in terms of implementing the Affordable Care Act and what people are trying to do to transform healthcare in Whatcom County. So May 27th, another program I think you'll all enjoy. Today, we have a program that all of you, I know, are looking to find very interesting. It's Bellingham's Waterfront, from early visioning to development agreement. As you know, most recently, after a long series of negotiations and a history before that of 10 years, the Port Commissioners on March 31st agreed to sign an agreement with Harcourt Development for some parcels on the waterfront. Many of you got a chance to see a number of the various iterations of what citizens have looked at and various committees have done since 2001. And at the end is on the easel out there is a schematic from the port on the contents of the new agreement. So we're going to start off with Dave Christensen, who is an architect. Mr. Christensen has over 40 years experience in architectural design and master planning. He's worked on almost any kind of project you can think of, from dog houses to solar-heated oyster hatcheries to high-rises and large-scale master plans. He also specializes in facilitating collaborative planning workshops called design charrettes. He's lived in Bellingham since 1972 and has received over 44 national and regional design awards. He's also been actively involved in the planning of the Bellingham waterfront since 2001 with the Port and the City of Bellingham, Western Washington University, the Public Development Authority, consulting teams, and private citizens. Please join me in welcoming David Christensen.
No, it's coming here. The clicker's coming. Well, I'll start off saying, wow, didn't realize I was involved with all those people. And actually, how it did start, in your paper there, you'll see that they said I started in 2003, but actually it started in 2001. We're the port had asked me to facilitate a little planning session, and we were to promote the waterfront to what's the advantages, what's the disadvantages of the waterfront. And at this meeting, I was told, now don't talk about Georgia Pacific. They're the big guns in the room, don't talk about them, we're playing around them. They're important. So we're at this meeting, we're planning everything around them. We were down at the boathouse. And in the back of the room, Chip Hilardes, who was the manager of Georgia Pacific, said, you know, I think we might want to be part of this planning process. You could hear a pin drop in the room. It's like, Yahoo! I pulled off the thing and we've got the crayons out, and it's like we got the waterfront plan to start on. And that started it in 2001. And that's when we first started getting a lot of people involved. Now, what is interesting here, now I'm going to boil down, I boiled down all these slides from, 200 to 100 to 50, down to 28 slides. There's been a lot of things going on. And the other day, somebody came to me, wanted to go out for coffee. They had all these ideas about waterfront planning. And they'd only been here a few years. And so we had coffee, and he's telling me all these things, and I'm like, oh, gosh. you know, it's all been kind of thought of. And did you know that there's 10,000 more people here in Bellingham since we started this? And there's a replacement of people who have left and come back. There's probably 15 to 20,000 different people here through this process who have no idea a lot of these sketches and ideas and all this thing has been thought of leading up to where we are today. And some of that maybe need to move forward. So I'll go forward here. So this was the very first little map we did. We didn't want to do any planning. What we talked about was what is the advantages and disadvantages. We talked about the cultural, natural resources, education, environment. What are the areas that take advantage of our waterfront? And it was all talking about that. And it was kind of a promotional poster. This was back in, and this kind of started everything going. And of course, what's the first thing you do? You bring in the gurus. And so we started with the design assistance team, the local American Institute of Architects, who I was president of. We brought in gurus around to start planning process. We had the Waterfront Center from Boston come here, and we started the process. It was a kind of volunteer effort. And we came up with the design assistance team master plan for all the waterfront. From there, it went to, now it's time to get serious about planning, and we had the Waterfront Futures Group. And this was a lot of people, a variety of people from the community. We had engineering, we had environmental, we had marine trades. It was kind of that triple bottom line of everything, representing finance, environment, social aspects that were important to how we develop the waterfront, because it needs to be a balance of all those things. And they spent hundreds and hundreds of hours going through this process. And when we started this, we actually were planning the entire waterfront, everything in the city of Bellingham, all the way down by Woodstock Farms, all the way up past the cement plant. We went through and planned all that area about what should happen, how will we put the vision on how this should go. And we had a plan for the Waterfront Center that came out of this Waterfront Futures Group that would lead to vignettes and sketches of what this could look like. Even the grand picture of, you know, what should happen here? What could happen here? And everyone got very excited about doing this because the community got involved, all kinds of ideas. I mean, wild, wacky ideas from anything you could think of. Anything you can think of has been documented. I mean, from, you know, wild carousels and funiculars up to the college to, you know, just one big park to nothing but industry to, I mean, everything in between, all that. Then, so you've got this Waterfront Futures document. And we've got all these mini plans and kind of guiding principles of what is important for guiding the waterfront. Then we have the Waterfront Advisory Group, the WAG. So these are also other people from the community looking like herding cats here down on the waterfront. And when that was all done, we kind of did a charrette and kind of boiled all this down to a written document. We were kind of brainstorming this thing to, these are the kind of metrics for how the development should move forward. Then we did kind of a initial master plan with the port here of how this property could happen, where should open space be, how the connectivity of trails should happen around here, and what are vignettes of what those could look like. So that these are kind of guiding principles as we move forward on the waterfront. I mean, it's a unique opportunity here. What should happen here? It's a time to think about planning for the long term about how it could develop, and this was part of that guiding principles. Meanwhile, while all this is going, so the city and port are going through this process. The city was disagreeing with some early master plans about the grid of the connectivity to downtown. What way should the streets go? If you know Bellingham, it's a crash of three communities, you know, Seaholm, Bellingham, Fairhaven, and all the grids kind of crash together downtown. It's very difficult to tell somebody how to get from Fairhaven to Birchwood. Just go to the freeway and take the exit, you know, so there was other plans developed, the center plan, and talked about this. And then meanwhile, there's other independent plans happening, and this is one with John Blethen was promoting how the best to develop this. So other individual consultants, active citizens have other plans that say this is the best way to do this, incorporating all the things that have been talked about because we felt the consultants from out of town weren't getting it. And then There's yet another group, the Bellingham Bay Foundation, and they hired gurus from Denver to come out here to plan how this should happen. And there was other city fathers coming and contributing to this effort. And you can actually see some of the original watercolors they did for the Bellingham Bay Foundation over here against the wall on the chairs. Pretty gorgeous renderings about, where is this thing going? What should this look like? And how do we get there? There's yet another variation on a private citizen plan. And then another city plan for how this should happen. And so all this kind of going back and forth is going on to able to narrow down the metrics of how the development plan should happen. And there were sketches and renderings. God, just think if we had all the money for all the consultants on this, we could actually probably build something, I think. I am sure. And then, so there's this conflict between the city and the port about how it should happen best for the community. And so a group of local architects, we call ourselves the Architects Evaluation Team, got together here and we decided we're going to help the city and port come together on this thing. We made a presentation to council and the port and talked about what are the best things of both items and how we can blend them all together. And we ended up with this evaluation of all the different things. We had this long presentation here, and I didn't want to put them all here. But at the very end, I said, a revised layout must create a wow factor. Some for economic development and community connection to our waterfront. That's what was missing. We needed that, something to engage the public to say, wow, I can't wait to do that. That would be so cool. I would just, Then, meanwhile, Western is also doing something because they have a property down there also that they are being allocated to do either an environmental campus or arts campus or something down there. So I was involved with that. Okay, and they were putting through, we did a big study to see how, if they developed down there, how should that work for them? How would it take advantage of the waterfront, the connectivity, the location on the planet? I mean, they were very cosmic. We had gurus from all over coming together on that thing. It was very exciting. Then the Public Development Authority also had a plan when they had the Army Street here on how to connect down to the waterfront, and how this connection happened down to Boulevard Park. Not Boulevard Park, Cornwall Park. And you can kind of see a trail connection, kind of a big gray area, kind of this no man's land that we're kind of still working on. But the plan should be, how does this happen over time? I mean, it can be light industrial or whatever uses initially, but how will it change over time? As we know, all zones change over time, all plans. So something that started off as a small one-story, now is a four-story, and it'll just keep changing. But we got a plan for that eventual future. And so there was actually a plan for Boulevard, or for Cornwall Park, that had how the property could develop, the open space down there. You see it right now. It's where the big white tarps are right down there. And creating a public space down there and some private development in this variation. And then connecting an overwater walkway over to Boulevard Park. And you can see from this rendering, that was kind of coming from Boulevard Park over to the Cornwall Park. So there was all kinds of things. And he was engaging the Native American tribes around here, how we can celebrate their history and prehistory before a white man came here. Then there was a lot of detailed study. There was stormwater analysis about how should stormwater be analyzed on the site. I mean, we went through environment, details, engineering, all kinds of stuff. And of course, all this used to be water out here. So it's all fill. So it all needs piling. I mean, and Georgia Pacific has made some toxic things down there. And then, of course, the other consultants will come in and say, hey, we want to develop something right now. We're tired of waiting. It's been a long time. And so this is the granary building. And you see at the top, that's what it looks like today. And this was an idea of redeveloping, and there's developers ready to do that. Now Harcourt has this to develop it, but there's been several ideas on how this can be very viable. It's a very historic building and can happen. Then, lastly, this was the original Harcourt development. You may not have seen this, but this was when the port put out a proposal, this is what it looked like. And it was very visionary, looking at how is the best way to have some excitement and build something connective here. There's some, it needs to listen a lot. Planning and design is actually pretty easy. You just have to listen and do a design. I mean, I have maybe architectural skills that you don't, or drawing, but it's just listening to what you say. And that's what the plan needs to do in moving forward with the community. Now, one thing, I don't know how many of you knew Mike Cole, who passed away recently. And if you read his obituary, something at the end there really struck me. It's a wise man who plants a tree under whose shade he will never sit. And, you know, if you think we were just talking at our table here, you know, if the forefathers at New York City had never planned for Central Park, yeah, I mean, it just wouldn't have happened. It's too valuable land, but they thought this is important. And way back when, before it was insane to dedicate that much land for a Central Park. And that kind of thing, that kind of long-term thinking needs to happen here about where this will end up going. So it's thinking with the end in mind and always remembering and getting that excitement back again about re-engaging. It's been several years, it's been kind of quiet zone here for a while, and a lot of people don't know everything that's gone on in the past. But a lot of things are in documents about our planning principles, our guiding principles, and those things should probably be looked at again to make sure that where this is going now is ending up where we want our grandchildren to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Our next speaker is Rob Fix, who is Executive Director of the Port of Bellingham. He's lived in Bellingham since 1999 and came to the port in 2008. He first served as the Chief Financial Officer, Real Estate Division Manager, Deputy Director, and in 2012 he was appointed the port's Executive Director. But before joining the port, Rob was a partner and chief financial officer for MTM Luxury Lodging and FST Asset Management, and had also served as chief financial officer for Trillium Corporation. He is a graduate of Washington State University with a bachelor's degree in hotel and restaurant administration. Please welcome Rob Fix.
Thank you, Don. Thanks, everyone, for coming today. Everyone's interest in the waterfront is appreciated here. I really appreciate Mr. Christensen's comments and some of the history that happened before I was involved, so it's always good to hear about that. I'm going to focus more on the Harcourt agreement and how we got to where we are with Harcourt, and then I'll try and do that fairly quickly so we can get to your questions, which are probably the most important part. A little bit of a timeline. The port started looking at the GP site 2003 approximately with the Waterfront Futures Group. Other groups were formed that you just heard about, the WAG. A lot of process was happening behind the scenes, SEPA, environmental studies, a lot of draft plans, regulations, et cetera. A major milestone occurred in December of 2013 when the City Council and the Port Commission approved the master plan documents. So this was a significant step for us because now we had the zoning in place and we had an idea of what we could and could not do down on the site. We consider the waterfront district to be 5 unique areas. And those areas start with the purple area at the very top. We call that the marine trades zone. That is marine trades. It will always be marine trades, and it's reserved specifically for that activity. In the very bottom of the screen, you'll see an orange area called Cornwall Beach. Cornwall Beach used to be owned 51% by the port, 49% by the city. The city owned a bunch of pocket areas up here in the purple area. They had some pieces of property up there. We wanted the Cornwall Beach area to be all park. And the port doesn't do parks particularly well, and we do marine trades pretty well, so we swapped the land. It was just a straight across exchange. There was no money involved. It was a very simple exchange. It just made a lot of sense. It put the marine trades lands in the port's hands, and it put the parks lands in the city's hands. As you move up the site, you get to the green area. It's called the shipping terminal. It's one of the most underutilized assets in our county. It hasn't been used probably since 2002, 2003. We'd very much like to put that back to work. One of the limiting factors has always been its footprint. It's a very skinny, narrow, and small footprint. And folks who do that type of business want a bigger piece of property. They need the laydown area. They need more room to work. So the thinking was we combine it with the yellow area, the log pond site, to make what we call a light industrial area. And we put the shipping terminal and the log pond together, and now we have the critical mass that will attract a user or a company that will bring jobs down onto the site. They'll use our shipping terminal, and they'll employ a lot of folks. That brings us to the blue area. That's what we're going to talk about today. The blue area is about 37 acres. It's what we call the downtown waterfront area. The downtown waterfront area is adjacent to downtown. One of the things we heard, a common theme from every developer we talked to and a lot of planners, was that it needed to have seamless connections to the downtown. We didn't want two distinct areas. We needed one connection to our waterfront so that downtown was just seamless all the way down to the water. The blue area there is not the entire area that's under contract with Harcourt. It's about 37 acres in blue there. Harcourt has the rights to develop about 18.8 acres. The difference is a lot of parkland. It's some land that's not under development with Harcourt. It's roads, streets. And then finally, there's about 6 acres in that blue area that's reserved for Western Crossings, which is a joint venture between Western Washington University and the port. And it's currently being programmed by Western as to what kind of activities they want to put down in their 6 acres. The port went out for proposals in June of 2013. So by now, by this time, we've done enough work with the city that we're pretty comfortable with what the master plan is going to look like. There's a lot of details. We're still being worked out on that. But we thought we had the basis to go out there and request developers and get them involved in the process. So in June of 2013, the red triangles you see there, the red outlines, are the property that we asked developers to make proposals on. We got a total of 7 proposals. Only 4 of those are what I would consider master development proposals. The other 3 were project specific. Specifically, they were for the granary building. So the port put together a team to evaluate these proposals. It included representatives from the city, from Western, from the county, from our consultant, Heartland, and then, of course, from the port. Harcourt was unanimously selected out of those 4 master developer proposals because of their experience, because we thought they had the bandwidth to be able to get this done. So we selected them to do further negotiations. As we did our negotiations with Harcourt, we also conducted due diligence. And the due diligence involved some legal aspects. Our lawyers looked at some past litigation that Harcourt was involved in. And please keep in mind that any developer of the size of Harcourt has probably been to court a time or two. We did some financial due diligence. That was, I have a financial background, so I looked at their balance sheet and their profit and loss statements. And then we did some physical due diligence. I was fortunate enough to be able to go over to Ireland and look at properties in Dublin. Park West was a very similar development to what we have here in Bellingham. It's not on the water, but it is a industrial, commercial mixed use with office, retail, residential, and hotel in it. So it's very similar to how we wanted our site, and very similar in size as well to what our site's going to look like. And then we checked references, and the references were other public officials that they had worked with, or other project managers they had done work with in both Dublin, in Belfast at the Titanic Quarter, and then again in Liverpool, where they have a development just beginning, and they've recently opened up a hotel. Harcourt's vision was largely consistent with the master plan. That's important to note. It's not exactly what the master plan is, but it falls within the zoning specs. And the only thing I can tell you about the drawing up there is it's probably not what it'll look like in 20 years. I don't think anyone knows what it'll look like in 20 years. And I think one of the things that the city and the port had the foresight to do was create a master plan that had some flexibility to it. And it allows for changes. However, it's important to note that any of these changes that will be put forth by Harcourt will have to go through a rigorous public process. If the changes are significant enough, the public will have another shot at feedback to both the port and the city before those changes can take place. Currently, Harcourt is working within, they're kind of coloring between the lines, and they're working within the master plan. I talked a little bit about Western Crossing earlier. They have 6 acres on the site. Harcourt does not have the rights to develop those 6 acres. That's not included in their master development agreement. However, there's nothing to preclude Harcourt from reaching an agreement with Western Crossing to develop those 6 acres. This is going to be hard to see, but there's some hatched areas in here, and this is the area the master development agreement covers out of that whole blue area. So the whole blue area is kind of what's in pink, plus this blue square, plus this little hatched area here. That's what you saw on the previous slide with the big blue. The hatched area is actually what's in the MDA with Harcourt, and that's this piece up here, and it's this piece right here. And that totals 18.8 acres. Again, the blue area is the Western Crossing right there in the middle. You see the board mill building there. Harcourt has expressed some interest in redeveloping that. They like the uniqueness of the building. I believe the digester building, which is just to the north of that right there, I believe that will be demolished in the next couple of months, along with the chipper and debarker right over in this area that will also come down. One of the things I liked, I called them buildings, and that's actually a mistake because they weren't built as buildings. They were never, the digester building and the chipper and the debarker were not built to house people. They didn't have offices in them, and they weren't meant for people. They were meant as equipment shelters. They were built and designed to protect equipment. So in order to reuse them for any kind of people purposes, I think it doesn't make a lot of sense, and it would be financially prohibitive to do so. We have formed kind of a public-private partnership. It doesn't meet the legal definition of what you would call a public-private partnership, but we've got a private company in Harcourt working with the city, working with the port, and working with Western to develop this site. So it is pretty much a public-private partnership. The port will be in charge of doing all the cleanup on the site. The city will be charged with installing utilities and arterial streets and the parks. Western Crossing is still doing the programming for their piece of the site, and that'll be negotiated at a later date. And then Harcourt will be doing the buildings, any interior roads, and other open spaces. And when I mean interior roads, I'm talking about non-arterial roads. Harcourt has a schedule they have to adhere to for development. We thought it was very important that the site be put back to productive use. So the Harcourt, and this is a default schedule. This isn't a schedule that we expect they'll perform by, and it's not a schedule they expect they'll perform by. It is a schedule where if they don't perform by, then default under the agreement. So they must have the granary building developed by 2019. They must have a second building. We anticipate that to be around 40,000 square feet, but they must have a second building built by 2021, a third building by 2024, and then you'll see 1 million square feet by 2034. What's that mean? What's that in scale? So we believe the Barclay Village is about 750,000 square feet, and that's been being developed for over 20 years. The Bellwether Peninsula, where the Bellwether Hotel is, and there's several office buildings and restaurants down there, 250,000 square feet, 250,000 square feet, and it's been over 25 years in the works. So when we look at this and say we need to have 1 million square feet in the next, 19 years, it's a pretty good pace of development. Just and emphasize a point there is that the actual pace of development that will occur on the site won't be dictated by the port. It won't be dictated by Harcourt. It'll be dictated by the market. The market will justify the pace of development down on the site. So Harcourt buys the land, and they're going to take it down in chunks. They don't buy the full 18.8 acres right on day one. They buy 2 or 3 acre parcels is what we anticipate. But what they do is they put together a proposal for a certain amount of acres, and they bring it to the Port Commission, and the Port Commission then says yay or nay to it. Then they have to go to the city to get permits to do their project. So there's still more process in this as Harcourt develops along the way. They'll pay us $20 per square foot. I'll get into that valuation in the next slide. That increases by about 3% per year. They must follow the schedule that I outlined in the previous slide. They have the option to lease. Although we believe they'll buy, they do have the option to lease. And they're going to pay us $200,000 for the granary building 10 days after the agreement is signed, which just landed on their desk on Tuesday. So the Port Commission approved this on March 31st. The Port Commission requested some changes to the agreement, mostly typos and some very small stuff. So we negotiated that with the Harcourt attorney representative down in Seattle, and that's what we've been doing since March 31st. The agreement was shipped off to Ireland last week, and it landed on their desk yesterday. The $20 per foot valuation came from a combination of a couple of appraisals. We then took those appraisals and we credited them for the city-installed infrastructure. That increases the value of the land, the fact that the city's doing the roads and the utilities. We decreased the valuation because it's a brownfield site and because it has some underground infrastructure, industrial artifacts that are, we don't even know what's there. And they're going to run into that as they're building. It's going to make building on that site a little more expensive than it would be on a greenfield or on a non-brownfield site. And then the Port Commission really considered this hard. Rather than maximizing the dollar per foot or the dollar per acre that they got, the Port Commission's objective was to put the property back to productive use. It was to get it back on the tax rolls, and it was to get jobs back down on the site. So it was more important to your Port Commission to get this property back to productive use in a timely manner than it was to hold out for the top value. These are factors the Port Commission took into consideration before making their decision on March 31st. Some of the things they considered is that we are a tertiary market. I've heard a lot of people say to me, they've questioned me, well, why isn't Harcourt paying for an option? They've essentially got an option on the site. Why aren't they paying for it? I've heard questions about why is it $20 a square foot when other property in South Lake Union is going for $200 a square foot. The answer is we're not South Lake Union, we're not Seattle, we're not Bellevue. We're in what we call a tertiary market. We're not even in a secondary market. We're a tertiary market. So it's hard to attract investment to that type of a market unless you're willing to make some concessions and not consider yourself to be South Lake Union. Harcourt Bellingham LLC is required to have a couple key members involved. One of the things that appealed to us about Harcourt was their experience with developing brownfield sites. So we required the 3 people that we believe had the most experience from their organization to stay involved in this project in the early phases. It's what we call a key person requirement. The Port Commission was advised that they could seek out other alternatives to the Harcourt transaction, and that was another master developer. We could go out for another request for proposals. It's a different year. The zoning is now in place. Maybe we'd get a different result. We could sell the development parcel by parcel. We could undertake the development ourselves, similar to what we did in the Bellwether. The Port did the early stages of the Bellwether development to kind of kickstart it. And we could do nothing. We could sit on the land, leave it fenced off, and hope for a better price in the future. They took all that into consideration, and I think they voted appropriately to pursue an agreement with Harcourt. It's a lengthy agreement. It's a complicated agreement, but I believe it benefits the folks of Whatcom County. I believe it's got some parameters in there that will hold Harcourt responsible for responsible development. And it really outlines what everyone's roles are. The Port and the city have lots of agreements on this site that outline our roles, and it's important to have as strong of an agreement with Harcourt for their roles on the site. And with that, I'll conclude my presentation, and I think after Mayor Kelli Linville talks, we'll be open up for questions.
Thank you, Rob. Our next speaker is Mayor Kelli Linville. She's a 4th-generation Whatcom County resident, small business owner, former educator, and a state legislator with more than 4 decades of community service in total in Bellingham. Mayor Linville was born and raised in Bellingham and holds bachelor's and master's degrees in speech language pathology from Western. And she worked for 16 years as speech pathologist in Bellingham Public Schools. In 1992, she was elected to the State House of Representatives and represented the 42nd District for a total of 17 years. From 2009 to 2010, she chaired the House Ways and Means Committee, big budget group. And she has been mayor of Bellingham since January 1st, 2012. Please welcome Mayor Kelli Linville.
Does anyone else think that 4 decades of public service makes you feel old? I'm happy to do it, but that is a lot of years. First of all, I love to see so many people here wanting to hear about the project that hopefully you're going to start observing down at the waterfront. I'm excited. And I'm excited for 3 reasons. I'm excited because we're now going to start implementing something that obviously through Dave's presentation, you know, that we planned and we talked about for many years. I started working on the waterfront when Georgia Pacific closed because we worked to get the employees down there worker retraining so that they could go on to something else. Many of them have worked at the mill for 30 years, for 35 years. They weren't ready to retire, and they didn't have any other skills to go someplace else. So that was my first experience with that site. The second was getting money to do the environmental cleanup. The Model Toxics Control Act money was very important, is very important for the port and for the city, because we have some of our own cleanups to do, it was important that we share with the state government the money that comes to clean up environmental, I was going to say dirt, but that's what I meant, to clean up the environmental degradation of places down at the port because it was an industrial user. And then the third thing was the tax increment financing that I was able to get that give the city $25 million in matching money, up to $1 million every year for the investments that the city's making into the infrastructure that Rob was talking about, what our agreement is. So I'm excited for all those reasons. And I want to thank Seth Fleetwood, who is sitting back in the corner. Raise your hand, Seth. Everybody knows who he is. Seth was the president of the city council the year that we signed our agreement with the port. And I don't think we can even explain how many hours the council members, the city staff, the port staff, the commissioners, and the executives worked on this. But Seth and I had our own signing ceremony when it was all over. We got a copy of the resolution, and we both signed it in the mayor's boardroom, and it's the one thing I have that hangs outside my office because I am so happy to try to give this site back to the citizens who have looked at it empty for so many years. So I'm extremely excited. What questions did I ask as we were looking at a developer? First, I wanted to make sure that the agreement that we had negotiated so hard with the port, which basically I think is more advantageous to the city now, mainly in the area of infrastructure investment. We don't have to invest $60 million right up front and hope somebody will come and build a business on the port site. We get to invest as the property is developed, and that means we have funded the Granary Blodell Road, which will be the main road into the site between Roeder and Cornwall, yeah. I live here, so I don't know the names of the streets. I just drive to where I want to go. And that's going to be a $9 million investment rather than a $60 million upfront investment. I think it's a better way for the city to use its resources to make sure that everything doesn't get sucked into the waterfront and we're still paying attention citywide. So this agreement with Harcourt is consistent with what the port and the city had agreed to. And that's important to me because the very first, I think you saw the first Harcourt design and you saw the big circle at the end, and there were some concerns about that first design. Mostly that it didn't fit into the character of the city. While we want cutting edge and exciting and wow, and I almost pulled out my hamster wheel button that I got at Kapow, we also want it to be seamless from our downtown out to our waterfront, so people understand that this is all city center. There's not two different cities here. So I was very pleased with that, and I was also pleased that this developer had a track record, and a track record on large projects, and that we did due diligence to make sure that we had a real partner that was going to complete something, so you all don't have to wonder what that's going to be. And secondly, that we had an out so that if they didn't, we didn't leave that site down there empty and uncleaned up for any more years. So I agree with Rob that I'd like to answer your questions as much or more than I'd like to just talk to you about this. It's been a long process. Is it perfect? I don't think so. I think there was a vision to begin with. There was kind of a vision in the middle. And in the end, the three goals that the city had was cleanup, first of all. The second one was access, get people back down to the site, connect with people of Bellingham and Whatcom County with their waterfront again. And then the third one was jobs. When Georgia Pacific closed, we lost a lot of family wage jobs in the city of Bellingham. Now, having that plant in the middle of our city, maybe that wasn't the best idea in the world, especially when they were producing chlorine. But the fact of the matter is, we displaced a lot of working families when that plant closed. So what can we do now? We can look for the kinds of light industrial development we want, and while we get all the amenities we want, and the access we want, and the cleanup we want, that doesn't mean that we can't strive for good-paying light manufacturing jobs on that waterfront, so everybody can live in Bellingham and recreate in Bellingham and buy a home in Bellingham. And that's my goal. So I think that the City Council set some very high standards. Certainly I agreed with them, and I think that we achieved those through our negotiations. So with that, I'm going to stop and be very happy to answer any of your questions. Oh, can I say one more thing? There are two people sitting at the table with me. Amy Cram, who is a city attorney, and Tara Sundin, who was the project manager for the city on the waterfront. And without these hours and hours and hours that these two women spent checking every line, rewriting stuff if they needed to, Rob, right? We wouldn't have gotten this done in the timely fashion that we did, and I think the product is much better for their efforts. So as you clap, will you include them in your thank you? Okay, up there?
Okay, very good. Okay, now we come to the time when we have questions from the audience. And again, we have a lot of new people here. So our philosophy here is that questions really should be questions, not paragraphs or pages that end with a question mark in your voice. So please think about your question, be succinct, and we'll have answers. You can direct it to one of the panelists or all three, but they'll all have a chance to comment on any of the questions. First question.
I'm interested in the thoughts of all of you on the realignment through the site. All of the plans on the walls and that you just showed us today, as well as Burlington, the city, the port, Washington Department of Transportation for a couple of decades have been working on the realignment. And yet the Harcourt plans look like they might be constrained by the existing S-curve. And I'm wondering what's going to be done. I mean, there's been Tiger grants, there's been State Department of Transportation grants. It's a long time we've been trying to move that. How does that play into the flexibility that they're going to have? Thank you.
That's a Burlington Northern question.
I'll take the first shot at that. It does sound a little bit like a Burlington Northern question. You know, nothing's final until it's actually built and done. Now, the master planning calls for the streets to go in a certain direction, and I believe the main arterials are not going to vary much from that because a lot of planning and a lot of money has already been spent on that. But ultimately, the answer to that question isn't going to come until Harcourt comes out here and sits down with the city and the port and really blesses it and says, no, it needs to move 5 feet this way or 5 feet that way. There are provisions for slight changes like that, but I don't think you'll see a significant variation from the master plan.
And you're talking about the roads?
That's right.
Okay. And I think Rob was talking about the roads. Are you talking about the railway, or the road grid?
The railway.
Yeah. So I think that's,
Okay.
Go ahead. You want to start?
So the railway is not going to relocate anytime in probably the next 10 years, but we are in active dialogue with BNSF about moving the railway back to the bluff. 5 years ago, they didn't have as much interest in doing that. They've had some change in leadership at the railroad. They seem to be a lot more cooperative, a lot more working with cities in their jurisdiction, and they're clearly working better with the port. So I believe we'll make progress in the next 5 to 10 years on getting that railway relocated. It's a very expensive proposition. It requires a new Cornwall Avenue bridge, which I believe is probably somewhere around a $50 million expenditure. So all that has to be figured out how we're going to fund and pay for that before the railway can be moved.
And I guess what I'd say is the reason we left the arterials more planned and didn't leave the rest of the road so fixed is so, if that does happen, that we wouldn't be tearing up a bunch of roads. And we made a commitment to our arterials.
Next question.
My name is Sandy Lawrence, and I'm a relatively new member of City Club. I'd like to ask a deliberately provocative question about sea level rise. I've been studying a lot about energy systems and climate change the last few years. And in Antarctica, there are a couple of interesting phenomena taking place. In West Antarctica, there's an area where there's an unstoppable melt that could add up to 4 feet of sea level rise, and an equivalent area in East Antarctica that could add 10 feet. Now, this will take time, but according to the IPCC, we could have as much as 4 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. That's 85 years, one lifetime. So the question is, at what point does all this development become vulnerable to the changes in the coast?
I'll start. During the planning process, that was a big issue. Do you plan for it? I mean, obviously, the rest of the world has a bigger problem than just us. I mean, you could build a moat around us, but everything else floats. So was it 6 feet? Was it 3 feet? What's interesting is actually doing a cap on the site actually makes some sense because of some of the toxics there. So actually going up about 3 or 4 feet at least made some sense for planning, because actually a lot of the infrastructure and utilities could actually just kind of lay on the ground, and actually you would build up from there. So it was planned for something like that happening, at least in the initial plans. Do we put a dike out on Bellingham Bay? The predictions varied quite a bit. Down in Olympia, I remember they said they settled on 3 feet. Is it going to get worse? Is it going to get less? We had experts from A to Z, and we kind of settled on 3 feet, as I recall.
And Amy, our attorney, just said that it is included in the master plan. So definitely, the other issue that we looked at was liquefaction of the site, since it's all fill. So those were two things that had to be determined. One of which, if we look at the log pond and the shipping terminal as more industrial uses rather than residents or businesses, things like that, then that is less of a risk than if we're looking at dense development all the way out to the water. And I think that, Amy, do you know what was in the master agreement?
When applying for a new project, what we reviewed under the SEPA process is the best available science will have to be utilized at the time of the project permitting, so that we didn't commit ourselves to a certain number of feet because we don't know exactly what's going to happen. So the science that's available at the time of the application will have to be utilized under the plan.
But it will be considered. I think that's the question you were asking.
Back here.
Hi, my name's Harry Meyer. Okay. And my question is, this property is on the waterfront down there, which is, waterfront property is always very valuable. And the question I have is, why are we selling this land, and why are we not leasing it? I know you tried to discuss that a little bit, but my experience in the past, if you have waterfront property and you can lease it, you're in a much better position, and a lot of places do that. Like, for instance, the Irvine Ranch area in California, Newport Beach, Corona del Mar, Laguna, all these places. And the question is, why are we selling the land and not leasing it?
It's a great question. It's one that the Port Commission has debated at length. The early stages of looking at this in the planning process in 2008 era, the port kind of had a motto, and the motto was, we bought the land to clean it up, and we have to sell the land to pay for the cleanup. So that's kind of the short answer. The port doesn't typically sell waterfront land. In fact, we don't typically sell land. That's not what we do. And we clearly own a major percentage of the waterfront and intend to do so for a long time. However, when the port acquired the Georgia Pacific site, it internally had discussions that said we're going to make an exception to the port not selling land because it was the only way this deal really worked, is we needed to sell the land at the end of the day. Now, a lot of it's changed since then. We have an insurance policy in place that helps pay for the cleanup. We have MOTCA funding coming from the state. There's some uncertainty about the MOTCA funding, but it's there today. So it will be continually evaluated over time, and the option is to lease it, but the Harcourt also has the option of buying it. Well, and the port will, the city will always own the parks. The mayor just brought up a very good point. The city will always own the waterfront, which is parks. There's no development will happen adjacent to the water. That will be parkland. And then the right-of-ways and the streets and that portions of the site will always remain owned by the city. And the Harcourt agreement only calls for them to buy 18.8 acres of what is about a 140-acre site. So it's a very small percentage of the site that's actually being sold. The log pond area, the shipping terminal, and the areas outside of that 18.8 acres, the intent is to lease those lands like we have with other portions of the city.
My question is about impact fees. The city charges impact fees for new development to pay for the public infrastructure associated with those developments. My understanding is that those impact fees are not going to be collected for waterfront redevelopment. And my questions are two. One is, why is that the case, especially since it's down on the waterfront, which should be very valuable property? And the second is, how is the city going to make up that lost impact fee revenue? How are other taxpayers going to pay for that infrastructure?
Tara, to the rescue.
I'll let Tara tell. Tara can give the particulars, and then I'll put it in, or maybe I'll put in some context first. I was not here when the city decided to partner with a port to change this from a brownfield to a desirable place in our community. But I know that we decided that there would be concessions made to turn this from a brownfield, and a brownfield that would last for a very long time. And so I'm going to let Tara talk about the particulars about the impact fees. But one of the things to be real clear about is that the developers that are going to be down there are going to be paying for some of their share of the infrastructure that's going in. So we're not paying for all of it. So Tara, do you want to?
So the city charges two impact fees, one for park impacts and the other for transportation impacts. And the port has been given credit for existing or past use for the transportation impacts. So the previous use of Georgia Pacific have been granted to the port, and so they have a certain number of trips that they won't have to pay for. And that's common practice. The city does that across the city. But once they reach that point of impact that GP had at the kind of height of operations, then the developers will begin paying for traffic impact fees. So that's standard procedure at the city. Park impact fees, they're also being given a credit. The city is, as we take park land from the port, instead of paying cash for that property, they are going to receive park impact fee credit. So that's how that transaction's occurring.
I think there was another part in how does the city intend to make up for not having that? So is there?
Well, and I think that I guess that was the context that I was putting this in to begin with. I don't think it was ever determined that the city would be able to completely make up for every investment they're making, because some of the investments we're making are in the public interest.
Okay, next question.
We have one here. Up over there, go. You next. We all know that the access to the waterfront is bounded by the train tracks, and the development plan calls for all kinds of access across those train tracks. But in the development plans, what is being made, what contingencies are being made for a catastrophic train crash that involves hazardous waste, hazardous cargo, or simply a derailment of non-hazardous cargo?
Well, the port and the city have partnered on this particular project on the waterfront. The port, the city, and the county have partnered on the emergency, it keeps changing its name.
Command Center?
Yeah, the Emergency Command Center out at the airport, where we are combining all of our resources through all of our different agencies, the small cities, the commissioners, and going through extensive training and supporting. We just wrote a letter to Maria Cantwell this week, supporting her legislation that talks about training our first responders, about notifying us what's in the cars, about spreading out what we need to fight a fire or a spill or something like that throughout the corridor. And Maria, the good thing about Senator Cantwell is she is very aware that driving from, or railroading from North Dakota to the West Coast is one kind of a trip, and then going up the West Coast, where it's very populated, where there's lots of people, where there's lots of infrastructure, is different. And so what we're doing is we are preparing for whatever disaster might happen, and we're asking the federal and state government to partner with us because we can't afford it all, and we're actually in better shape than some of the other small communities. So our emergency management planning is going on parallel to everything that's going on with the railroad. Did that answer your question, Dan? Yes. Okay.
My name is Brian Griffin, and my question is for Rob Fix. Several months ago, I got a good look at the Harcourt plan, and I was very impressed with it. Now that Harcourt has been selected, and you're about to sign a contract, I presume, is there enough wiggle room in your planning to accommodate some of their plans' things?
That's a great question. Thank you, Brian.
I'm being your mother.
I don't think the mayor wanted me to talk.
I do.
It is a good question, and I believe the answer simply is yes. There is some wiggle room. The plan was designed knowing that there would be changes requested to it. If the changes are insignificant, there's some methods that those can just be easily done. If the changes are what we consider to be significant, it's going to involve some public process, and that's only fair to the public to get another bite at this if we're going to significantly change the agreement. That being said, I suspect there will be some minor changes in the early years, and the developments gets kicked off and gets some momentum going, and then I suspect at some point Harcourt's going to ask for some changes. I don't know what those changes will look like at this point. I don't think they probably know until they spend more time on the site. But those changes will be requested after they have more experience with the Bellingham market and they determine what that site should look like.
I know in the urban village plans, which this is incorporated, it's built into it to have design departures because things change over time for the market, demand. I mean, something that should be commercial, maybe residential or vice versa, mixed use, and form follows financing rate a lot of times. It doesn't necessarily follow function. So things will change, and if there's a departure from the prescriptive, or from the prescriptive way, there's a performance way to meet the intent of design guidelines. That's the way it's kind of written. Isn't that right, Tara?
Okay.
Mark Minnell. All of you mentioned jobs a few times as being critical to this development. So my question is, what's the strategy and plan and schedule for going out and attracting companies to come build down there, move their companies here? And do you have any kind of thoughts as to what kind of companies you're going to try and attract?
Well, the majority of the jobs, I believe, will land on the industrial or the light industrial side of the site, and the port is always trying to recruit those types of users. Keep in mind, though, that as we're trying to do that, so is every other community on the West Coast. In fact, every other community in the nation is trying to do that. But we are looking at different industries. We've had a couple of really hot leads in the last couple of years. Nothing has panned out for that portion of the site, but I'm confident that our efforts are going to pay off eventually. We're going to throw a little bit more resources at it this year than we have in the past. Now that we have the Harcourt agreement kind of behind us, I can focus more of the port's resources on attracting those types of jobs, and we intend to do that focus throughout the rest of this year and into next year.
And Rob and I just met with a company 2 weeks ago that would be just the kind of company that I think all of you would say, thank you for having that kind of company expand on our waterfront. And so we're also looking at our existing companies that are here so that maybe they'd like to expand in another location rather than always looking outside. But I think we're looking at we can be more, not selective. I don't mean we're judging everybody, but this is a great place to live. And so I think that's the kind of companies that we're going to attract, and that's another thing that's exciting.
If I could just add on to that, too, that one of the things that appealed to us about Harcourt was they're an international company that has done developments throughout the world, and they have these international connections with different businesses that we're hoping to draw on and help us to populate the site.
I'd just like to ask a question that will clarify for me and maybe for others. In some of the initial drawings and the community visionings, and in the original Harcourt proposal that you all referred to, and what Kelly, you said about the connectivity from downtown, there was this green park-like kind of connectivity. I'm wondering, I'm not sure, but can you explain how the initial phase of development will or will not preclude any of that from happening?
Well, I think when I had the development schedule up there, it called for the first piece of the development or the first project to be the granary building, and that needed to be completed by 2019, which is 4 years out. So in my mind, that gives us 4 years to work through a lot of the exact specifics that you're talking about, because the granary building will be developed and perhaps one other building be developed in the next 3-year time frame. During that time, we can work with Harcourt and the city and come up with the best ideas and get them implemented.
I'll just add that, I'm just the messenger here, and in listening to the community, even though the latest plan shows, at least for the moment here, shipping terminal and industrial land kind of blocking the development going south, there was a huge demand of trying to have a long-term connectivity from Fairhaven to Boulevard Park, over to Cornwall Beach, through the property, up over through to downtown, in a kind of a green space common thing that needs to happen. And it can happen, and going through the early process here, and this will change over time here, but when I'm listening to consultants we had for the Waterfront Futures Group and the WAG, they, at least long-term, felt that it wasn't very viable having a lot of heavy industrial or even light industrial use that needed shipping access because of the train access, because of truck access. It was just difficult at this site, even though we have a deep harbor pier there. So I'm just looking long-term out there, and having that connectivity was extremely important to everyone I heard, and having that happen somehow, it will be important as we move forward in the 20, 30, 40, 50 years.
And that was another part of our agreement with the port, is to not preclude that happening. The first, we have to do Granary Blodell, but then because the Whatcom Waterway cleanup permits have been granted to the port, the Whatcom Waterway Park will be that first green space that we'll be working on. We're working on the design for the park, and that's where you enter in the granary on one side and then the park right next to it.
Great, thank you. We have-
Just to add on to that, if
Sure.
I can really quickly, because Mr. Christensen is correct that the community is very interested in that connectivity. The good news is Harcourt is interested in that connectivity as well. So it's a balancing act. We have an industrial site down there. I always tell folks that baby strollers and forklifts don't necessarily mix, so we have to try and figure out how we can accommodate both of those on that limited footprint.
Great. One last question we have.
Mayor, I have one concern is, since the city planning department takes between 4 and 6 weeks to approve a set of drawings for a single-family home, is the city prepared to give Harcourt reasonable response time on the review of their plans?
Well, first of all, I'm going to invite you to visit with our planning director because we're going through some very extensive lean administration, and I think that one of our permits we can get in 7 days now.
Speaking to the lapel here.
7 days, Dave. Well, we're working on building more certainty into that. If there's a big project that we're working on, and we have several in the city, what we're trying to do now is make sure that they're project managed by a team rather than going person by person by person with paper on everybody's desk and not talking to each other. So what I would tell you is I think that obviously it's a large project. We would be looking at project managing that, but just in general for everybody in the city. We believe that the timeframes by which we make good decisions, this isn't just throw the decision out across the counter, but good decisions are going to be sped up by the processes that the planning department has committed to and our new permitting software.
This was in the early planning stage. This was really important, is that there was some predictability for developers. Otherwise, they wouldn't come. Bellingham is known in the past for a very long, arduous public process, and they want some predictability. Now, the urban village plan has some of that if you go prescriptive, but if it's a grand enough plan that makes sense, that meets the intent, it could also move forward. And I think the mayor's right that the staff has really increased the review time. It's really improved significantly in the city. And I think that will be the goal. That's one of our planning principles early, is having a predictable path to get permits.
Great. I know we could stay for a long time with more questions, but we're actually past our time to end. So I want to, first of all, ask you to thank the speakers for being here today, all of them.